Hey guys, Karenology here. Get ready because this story is pure chaos from start to finish.
The letter from Homeowner Association arrived with the usual smug official tone, but this time the demand was absurd beyond belief. Your private well violates environmental and aesthetic standards and must be sealed within 30 days. I read the words twice, then a third time, before laughing dryly. The well had been here for decades, long before HOA even existed. My father dug it himself. Now they wanted to take it away. I walked outside, crossing my yard to where the old stone well stood, a reliable source of water that had never failed us. The sun was setting behind the hills, casting an amber glow on the property. It was a good piece of land, something my parents had worked hard for. Losing the well wasn't just an inconvenience. It was an attack on my family's history. Greg, my neighbor, was already waiting for me by the fence. At 65, he was a retired engineer with sharp eyes and a sharper mind. He leaned on the wooden posts and smirked when he saw my face. "Let me guess, HOA sent you a lovely notice? They want me to seal the well." I handed him the letter. He squinted at it and whistled. "Damn, they really don't like people being self-sufficient. Do you know anything about this new rule? I don't remember any discussions about banning wells." Greg shook his head. "That's because there wasn't one. They snuck this in last month under Community Beautification and Environmental Protection." His expression darkened. "They're working with the new water company that just moved in. You notice how everyone's been getting higher bills lately? That's no coincidence. They're trying to make sure everyone is completely dependent on them." I exhaled slowly. Of course, it was always about money. HOA didn't care about the environment. They cared about power. Later that night, I pulled up the HOA bylaws, searching for anything related to water usage. Buried deep in a recently amended section, I found it. All homeowners must be connected to the approved municipal water supply. Unauthorized private wells will be deemed a violation subject to immediate action. It was vague but effective. If they controlled the water, they controlled the people. The next morning, I went straight to the HOA office, a small but self-important building at the center of our community. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and fake professionalism. At the front desk sat Karen, HOA's self-appointed enforcer. She was the type who thrived on power in the pettiest ways. A woman in her 50s with a stiff blonde bob and a floral blouse that tried too hard to be friendly. She smiled when she saw me. "Mark, I was wondering when you'd stop by." I placed the letter on her desk. "I want to appeal this." Her smile didn't waver. "Oh, Mark, I understand your concerns, but this is for the good of the community. Private wells are unregulated, and we need to ensure that everyone follows the same environmental standards. My well has been here for over 50 years. You can't just rewrite history because it's inconvenient for you." She sighed dramatically. "I understand how attached you are, but regulations change. If we made exceptions for everyone, there would be chaos. Then I'll take this to the board." Her expression hardened, but she maintained her sugary tone. "Of course you have that right. The next board meeting is in 2 weeks. You're welcome to make your case then, but I should warn you, these rules were put in place with full legal backing. If you don't comply within the 30-day window, we'll have to take further action." I knew what that meant. Fines, then legal threats, and if I kept resisting, they'd find a way to make my life a living hell. When I got back home, Greg was waiting for me. "So, what did they say?" "They're not backing down. They claim it's about environmental standards." Greg snorted. "Right. And I'm the King of England. Listen, I did some digging. The guy who runs that new water company? He's Karen's cousin." That sent a fresh wave of anger through me. It was worse than I thought. This wasn't just about HOA greed, it was personal enrichment. "We need to fight this," I muttered. "They're not just taking my well, they're setting a precedent. If they get away with this, next it'll be someone else's backyard, someone else's property." Greg nodded. "Then we'd better get to work." For the next few days I gathered every document I could find. Land records, property rights, historical maps. I needed proof that my well predated HOA authority. At the same time, I started talking to other neighbors, asking if they'd been targeted. Most people were too afraid to fight, but a few admitted they had received similar letters. Then, one night, I heard something. A faint grinding noise outside. My pulse quickened as I grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the porch. The noise was coming from the well. I crept closer, heart pounding. That's when I saw them. 2 men in dark clothes pouring something into the well. One of them turned, and the beam of my flashlight caught his face. My stomach dropped. It was a member of the HOA board. Before I could say anything, he bolted, his accomplice close behind. I ran to the well, shining my light inside. The water was murky, an oily film spreading across the surface. They were trying to poison it. I clenched my fists. This wasn't just about money anymore. They were willing to destroy something precious just to get their way. Greg was right, we were at war. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the reflection of the flashlight on the water, the oily film spreading like a sickness. They had crossed a line. Poisoning a well wasn't just a power move. It was an attack on something sacred, something that had kept my family alive for generations. And for what? Profit, control. The realization made my stomach turn. By morning, I had a plan. Greg was already up when I knocked on his door. He took one look at my face and let me inside without a word. "They tried to poison it," I said, and his expression darkened. "We need to test the water. If we can prove contamination, we have a real case against them." Greg nodded. "I know a guy who works in environmental testing. He owes me a favor. I'll get a sample to him today. But you know they're not going to stop, right? This was a warning. They wanted you to know they can get to you." I knew he was right. The HOA operated like a well-oiled machine, every move calculated, every attack designed to wear people down. But I wasn't about to roll over. "Then we hit them where it hurts," I said. "We take this public." Greg chuckled. "You're talking about a war." "They started it." That afternoon, I made my first move. I drafted a letter to the local newspaper detailing the sudden enforcement of the well ban, the suspicious connection between Karen and the new water company, and, most importantly, the attack on my well. I left out names for now, but the implications were clear. The HOA wasn't acting in the interest of the community. They were running a racket. Greg delivered the water sample while I made phone calls, reaching out to neighbors who had received similar notices. Most were hesitant. They had mortgages to worry about, families to protect. They'd seen what happened when people pushed back against HOA mandates, mysterious fines, threats of foreclosure, legal fees that piled up until they had no choice but to comply. But a few were willing to speak. An older couple at the end of the street had been forced to dismantle a rainwater collection system they'd used for years. Another neighbor had been fined repeatedly for using a backyard compost bin. Another so harassed he had finally moved. The more I dug, the clearer the pattern became. That night, I sat on my porch, watching the well, waiting. I wasn't stupid enough to think they wouldn't try again. Sure enough, around 2 in the morning, a car rolled slowly down the street and stopped in front of my house. The headlights switched off, but the engine kept running. I stood, gripping the bat I had brought outside with me. "Come on," I muttered. "Try it." After a minute, the car pulled away. No one got out. They were watching, waiting to see what I would do next. The next day, Greg called with the results. "It's bad," he said. "High levels of contaminants. Some of it's just runoff, but there's a chemical marker that suggests tampering. Whoever did this wasn't subtle. They wanted to make sure you saw the damage." I exhaled slowly. "Do we have enough to take to the city?" Greg hesitated. "It's not that simple. The HOA has legal jurisdiction over environmental regulations in the neighborhood. We can report it, but it'll take time to go through the system. Then we need leverage, something bigger." That night, I went back to the HOA office. It was closed, of course, but that didn't matter. I wasn't there to talk. I was there to find something they didn't want me to see. Greg had been right. If they had gone this far, they weren't going to stop. The only way to win was to hit first. The back door had an old lock, one that wasn't hard to pick. I slipped inside, heart pounding, and moved quickly through the darkened office. Filing cabinets lined the walls, folders stacked neatly, each labeled with the names of homeowners. I ran my fingers along the tabs until I found my own. Inside were pages of violations, warnings, correspondence, everything they had ever sent me. But that wasn't what I was looking for. I moved to the main desk, scanning the papers left out. Then I saw it. A contract. A formal agreement between the HOA and the water company. And at the bottom, Karen's signature. I took photos, making sure to get every page. This was proof that the well ban wasn't about environmental safety. It was about money, control. If I could get this in front of the right people, I could bring the whole thing down. As I turned to leave, I heard a noise outside. Footsteps. Someone was coming. I barely had time to slip behind a desk before the front door unlocked and light spilled into the room. Two voices. One of them was Karen. I held my breath as she walked in, flipping through a folder. "We need to move faster," she said. "If he doesn't comply by the end of the month, we escalate. We'll start with heavier fines. If that doesn't work, legal action. If that doesn't work, well, we have other methods." The other person, a man, grunted. "He's already causing too much trouble. Maybe we need to make an example out of him." Karen sighed. "We'll see, but one way or another, that well is going to be filled." My blood ran cold. They weren't just trying to take my well. They were planning to break me. I waited until they left before slipping out the back, heart hammering in my chest. This wasn't just about a well anymore. This was war. I barely slept after that night. My mind kept replaying Karen's words, the cold determination in her voice. They weren't going to stop. The HOA had a plan, and I was just an obstacle they needed to remove. But I wasn't about to make it easy for them. The next morning, I went straight to Greg's house. He opened the door before I could knock, looking at me with concern. "You look like hell," he said. "What happened?" I stepped inside and closed the door. "I was in the HOA office last night. They have a contract with the water company. Karen signed off on it herself. This well ban was never about regulations. It was about money." Greg's face hardened. "Did you take pictures?" I nodded. "Every page. But that's not the worst part. I overheard them talking. They're planning to escalate things. Heavier fines, legal action, and if that doesn't work, other methods." Greg exhaled slowly. "They're threatening you. It's not just me anymore. They're making an example out of me. If they win, they'll keep pushing people around until no one dares to fight back." Greg rubbed his jaw. "Then we need to strike first. We take this public. We expose everything." By midday, I had uploaded the photos online. I sent them to a local journalist who had covered HOA corruption before, along with a detailed explanation of what was happening. Within hours, the post started gaining traction. People were angry. Comments flooded in from other homeowners who had been harassed, fined, and bullied by HOA boards. That evening, the journalist called me. "This is big," she said, "but I need more. Something that will force them to respond. Do you have proof that the contamination in your well was intentional?" I hesitated. The water test results showed chemicals that shouldn't have been there, but it wasn't direct proof that HOA had done it. "Not yet," I admitted, "but I can get it." Greg and I spent the next 2 days installing hidden cameras around my property. If they tried anything else, I wanted it on tape. Meanwhile, the news was spreading. Several neighbors who had been afraid to speak out finally came forward. One man admitted that years ago, he had tried to fight an unfair HOA policy and ended up facing fabricated violations until he was forced to sell his home. A woman told me she had been threatened with foreclosure over an unpaid fine that turned out to be a clerical error. One HOA refused to correct until she lawyered up. The pressure was building, and then, just as I expected, they struck back. A letter arrived the next day. It wasn't from Karen. This one came from a law firm representing the HOA. The language was formal and cold. Immediate legal action will be pursued should you continue to spread misinformation and engage in activities that threaten the integrity of the Homeowner Association. Greg read it over my shoulder and snorted. They're scared. They wouldn't be lawyering up if they weren't. Scared people do stupid things, I muttered. We need to be ready for whatever's next. That night, the cameras caught them. 2 men, different from the first one, sneaking onto my property. One of them carried a hose, the other a bucket. They were pouring something into my well again. I called the journalist immediately. I have video proof. They're poisoning the well. Send it to me now. I'll get this on the air by morning. By sunrise, the footage was everywhere. The news station ran the story, showing the grainy night vision video of the 2 men tampering with my well. The headlines were brutal. HOA caught red-handed. Attempted well poisoning under investigation. Karen and the HOA were silent for the first few hours, but by the afternoon they had no choice but to respond. A statement was released, filled with weak denials and claims that I was fabricating evidence to tarnish the reputation of a respected community organization. But it was too late. People were furious. Homeowners in other neighborhoods started sharing their own HOA horror stories. The city council announced an emergency meeting to discuss potential legal actions. And then, the real bombshell dropped. Greg received a call from his contact at the environmental testing lab. You were right, the man said. The chemicals in the water, they match an industrial decontaminant used by the municipal water company. Someone didn't just try to poison your well, they used the same chemicals that company uses to treat water supplies. Someone with access. Greg relayed the news to me, his voice grim. Karen's cousin runs that company, remember? This ties directly back to them. I felt a surge of adrenaline. Then we have them. As I prepared to release this final piece of evidence, I knew the fight wasn't over yet. Karen and the HOA would push back harder than ever, but they were running out of room to hide. And I was just getting started. By the time the sun set, the entire neighborhood was buzzing. The news spread faster than I had expected. People who had always stayed quiet about HOA corruption were finally speaking up. Some sent me messages, sharing their own horror stories. Others stopped me in the street to offer support. But I knew it wasn't over yet. Karen and her people weren't going to back down easily. Greg showed up that evening looking grim. He handed me a printed email. Got this from a friend at City Hall. I scanned the page, my stomach twisting as I read. It was a notice from the HOA's legal team requesting an emergency injunction to stop defamatory actions against a reputable homeowners association. They were trying to gag me. If the court granted it, I wouldn't be able to speak publicly about the well, the poisoning, or anything else. Greg shook his head. They're desperate, but they still have influence. If this goes through, it buys them time. I clenched my jaw. Then we make sure it doesn't. The next morning, I contacted the journalist again. We need to get ahead of this. If they silence me, they'll bury the whole story. We need someone bigger involved. Within hours, national media picked up the story. A news crew showed up at my house, cameras rolling. They wanted footage of the well, interviews with me, Greg, and any neighbors willing to speak out. Karen must have seen the broadcast because, not an hour later, a brand new letter arrived from the HOA, this time threatening me with foreclosure. According to them, I had racked up thousands of dollars in compliance fines. Greg laughed when he read it. They really think they can scare you out of your own home. I wasn't laughing. They're not trying to scare me. They're trying to break me. If I lose the house, I lose the fight. That night, I barely slept. Every noise outside made me jump, half expecting to catch someone else trying to tamper with the well. My phone buzzed around 2 a.m. An unknown number. I answered cautiously, a man's voice, low and deliberate. Drop it. Withdraw the accusations, delete everything online, and this will all go away. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. And if I don't? A pause. Then you'll regret it. The line went dead. I stared at the phone. This wasn't just HOA pettiness anymore. This was something deeper, more dangerous. Greg showed up early the next morning, his face tight with concern. I don't like this. Someone's pulling strings behind the scenes. The HOA is powerful, but they're not usually this aggressive. I nodded. I think Karen's cousin is involved more than we thought. He runs the water company. But what if there's more? What if this isn't just about control? What if it's about something bigger? We started digging deeper. Public records, corporate filings, anything we could find. And then we hit something. A land development deal quietly pushed through the county a few months ago. The area where my well sat? It was part of a planned expansion for a luxury community. But only if the current homeowners were forced out. Greg whistled. They poisoned your well because they want you gone. They poisoned your water to make sure you had no choice but to leave. I sat back, heart pounding. This isn't about HOA rules. This is about money, lots of it. We compiled everything, emails, contracts, video evidence, and handed it to the journalist. Within hours, the story took a new turn. HOA water scandal tied to high-powered real estate deal flashed across the evening news. The city announced an official investigation, and then, finally, the cracks began to show. Karen was the first to fall. She resigned from the HOA the next day, claiming personal reasons. But we knew better. Then came the water company's CEO, Karen's cousin, who denied everything until leaked emails proved otherwise. Lawsuits started piling up. People who had been forced out of their homes came forward with stories eerily similar to mine. The final blow came 2 weeks later. The county revoked the land development deal, citing fraudulent practices. The HOA, suddenly exposed and drowning in legal battles, crumbled. Without Karen's iron grip and the water company's backing, they had nothing left. Greg and I stood by my well, watching as city officials ran tests, ensuring it was finally safe. He clapped me on the shoulder. "You did it." I exhaled, feeling the weight finally lift. We did it. It wasn't just about saving my well. It was about standing up against the kind of power that thought it could do whatever it wanted. This time, we won. But I knew there would always be another battle waiting. The days that followed felt surreal. The HOA was in full collapse, their legal battles piling up faster than they could respond. Without Karen at the helm, their once untouchable grip on the neighborhood disintegrated. But I knew better than to think it was over. People like Karen never truly disappear. They just lie low, waiting for their next move. Greg came over that afternoon with a six-pack and a grin. "You see the news? The water company's being audited. Seems like our little war stirred up more than just a few angry homeowners." I nodded, taking a beer. Good, they deserve everything coming to them, but something tells me Karen isn't done yet. Greg leaned against the porch railing. Probably not, but she's lost her leverage. Without the HOA, she's just another disgraced former board member. And from what I hear, she's trying to sell her house and leave town. I wasn't surprised. People like Karen thrived on control, and once they lost it, they ran. But I still had work to do. The well needed to be fully tested again to ensure it was safe, and I wanted to push for an official ordinance that would prevent any HOA from pulling something like this ever again. The next morning, I met with a city official who had taken an interest in the case. She listened intently as I explained the extent of the HOA's corruption, how they had manipulated policies, targeted homeowners, and even poisoned private property to get what they wanted. When I showed her the collected evidence, she sat back and let out a slow breath. This is bigger than just your neighborhood. We might be looking at a criminal case here. That was what I had been waiting for. The possibility that the people behind this might finally face real consequences. But before I could let myself feel any satisfaction, Greg called me with a warning. "Karen's back. She was seen at the HOA office this morning, clearing out files. I don't like it." I drove over to find her stuffing boxes into her car. She spotted me and smiled, but there was no real warmth behind it. "Come to gloat." I shook my head. "Just making sure you don't try anything on your way out." She sighed, shaking her head as if I had disappointed her. "You really think you won? You think any of this matters? HOA or not, there will always be someone in charge. Always someone with the power to make decisions that people like you don't like." I crossed my arms. And there will always be people like me who won't just roll over and take it. She gave a small laugh, shaking her head as she closed the trunk of her car. Enjoy your victory, Mark. But don't think for a second that it changes anything. People forget. They move on. And when they do, someone like me will be right there to take control again. She got into her car and drove off. I watched until she disappeared from view, the weight of her words settling into my chest. Maybe she was right. Maybe corruption was a cycle, something that would always find a way back. But for now, we had won. A week later, the official ruling came down. The HOA was officially dissolved, their remaining funds allocated to reimburse homeowners who had been wrongfully fined. The water company's license was revoked, pending further investigation. And as for Karen, no one knew exactly where she had gone. Just that she had left town, likely searching for the next community to sink her claws into. I stood by the well that evening watching the reflection of the setting sun in the water. Greg joined me, cracking open another beer. So, what now? I shrugged. We make sure this never happens again. We keep watching, keep fighting. We don't let them take anything else from us. He nodded, raising his bottle in a silent toast. To stubborn old men who refuse to back down, I chuckled, tapping my bottle against his. To making sure the next Karen never stands a chance. The well remained, untouched and unsealed. A testament to what we had fought for. A reminder that sometimes the little guy could win.